Hey guys, Aaron Cybertron Zhang here, and today I wanted to break down the grand finals for the 2022 Pokemon VGC World Championships in the Masters Division between Eduardo Cunha and Guillermo Castilla Diaz. This was the only World Championship in the Sword and Shield era, and it featured two of the best players in the history of the game. I'm trying out a bunch of new content on the channel, and I really like doing post-game analysis for games, not only that I've played, but also just really great VGC matches in general, and this finals definitely had a lot of excitement to it. So if this is something that you enjoy and want to see more of, definitely let me know in the comment section below and leave a like on the video. I'd really appreciate it. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Aaron, also known as Cybertron. I've qualified for 8 different World Championships myself and got third back in 2013. These days I focus a little bit more on creating content where I teach people how to play the game, and I also am a commentator for live streams. I've commentated a couple of different Worlds finals, including 2016, 18, and 19, and I also was an analyst for the VGC stream this year at Worlds. And so, yeah. Before I start this as well, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, these players are both much better than I am, and so it's a lot easier to analyze after it's all said and done, especially given that I have perfect information because I have access to both players', team sheets. But when you're playing in VGC, you're playing with imperfect information, right? There's only so much you know about your opponent's team, and so it's a lot easier to find what the absolute right play is maybe in retrospect, but it's so much harder when you're actually in the moment. And take it from someone that was this close to actually making Worlds finals but didn't actually make it there, right? It's really hard to even just make it to the finals of Worlds, let alone win. And both of these players are, truly phenomenal, and the skill that they displayed throughout the World Championships was just really second to none. And so I just want to highlight that because Pokemon is a really, really complex game, right? You can play the same matchup 10 different times and it can play out in 10 completely different ways, and it is really hard to consistently make good plays throughout, each turn when you only have 45 seconds. This format in particular, which allows 2 restricted Pokemon as well as Dynamax, is one of the most volatile formats in VGC history. In my eyes, this was the most difficult World Championship in VGC history, right? And so it's so easy, I think, to backseat game in VGC. It's so easy to say, oh, they should have just done this and that, but take it from someone, right, that's, almost been there. The pressure is unbelievable. There's so much stress. There's so little time to make your moves. And at the end of the day, it is just truly, it's exciting. It's exhilarating, right? This is what you live for, being in the finals of Worlds. But just wanted to preface with that because, yeah, I have access to all this information, whereas they definitely didn't when they were actually playing this match. And so just want to add some context there, but let's talk about the teams a little bit, and then we'll get started with the battles. Before diving into the actual finals, I wanted to briefly cover the teams that both players brought to the World Championships. I know that a lot of people look at these teams and think they look relatively standard, but you don't get to the finals of Worlds unless you have some really smart team building, and I think that both players made some really cool, small techs on these archetypes to really set themselves apart from all the other players who might have been using similar teams. So I want to start with Guillermo, who used Lunala and Groudon. Guillermo has been one of the most prominent Lunala Groudon players throughout the entire season. He got top 8 at the European Internationals with it earlier in the year, and then also managed to get day 2 at the North American Internationals with it as well. This is a new take that he brought to Worlds, and I want to start with the Lunala itself. As you'll notice, this is a very speedy Lunala. It's actually max speed with Hypnosis. This is a pretty strong deviation from how a lot of other players ran Lunala throughout the season. Some would run almost no speed and run Trick Room instead of Hypnosis. Some players would run Modest with max speed. Timid with max speed allows you to obviously outspeed all the other Lunalas that aren't Timid max, and you also are able to outspeed, everything in the base 90 to 95 range. So I think the lack of Trick Room makes a lot of sense on this team because you're using Pokemon like Charizard and Regieleki. Normally with the slow Lunalas, Trick Room makes a little bit more sense, but with this set, you can just have confidence that you're going to outspeed things like Kyogre and Groudon, for example. Hypnosis is also a really smart tech. It is a really high variance move because its accuracy is very low, obviously, for VGC, but the idea is that Hypnosis can turn a matchup that's really bad and slightly swing things into your favor, right? It's one of those moves that where also sometimes Lunala just doesn't really have anything better to go for, and so it's one of those where it's like, okay, if I hit it, it just puts me in a really good spot, whereas if I miss, I can still be in an okay position anyway. And so this in itself is already a kind of a unique Lunala set where not many players had explored this, I think, throughout the season. You've also got a really cool Charizard with Weakness Policy here. Weakness Policy Charizard is probably the most prominent metagame innovation that popped up at the World Championships this year. Pretty much almost all the top players moved away from Life Orb or Lumberry or Charty Berry with max speed and max special attack, and instead invested in a ton of bulk on Charizard with Weakness Policy. I thought that was a really interesting innovation, and basically with this HP and defense investment, when Charizard is Gigantamaxed, a Life Orb Max Lightning from Dynamax Thundurus, Let's Jolly, is never going to get a one-hit KO. And that's not even including Reflect from Grimmsnarl, right? So the idea is that Charizard can take Max Lightning and then retaliate back with a +2 G Max Wildfire, and Grimmsnarl with Reflect is really good support here as well. So bulky Charizard became a very prominent thing at Worlds this year, and I think it was really interesting to see how it went from, just max speed, max special attack to super bulky. Round the offense out, you've got Life Orb Regieleki here. This is a modest variant, and so the idea is that, this Regieleki can just blow so many things up. You can potentially get a one-hit knockout even onto bulky Zacian and Incineroar. It's just super powerful, but it's also quite valuable outside of Dynamax because you can Electro Web, and that combos really nicely with Charizard Lunala. And so, yeah, Dynamax Regieleki can put in a ton of work, especially against Kyogre teams. The last really offensive member of this team is a White Herb Swords Dance Groudon. White Herb here is a really nice item specifically against opposing Incineroars, and with the White Herb, it actually makes it really difficult for your opponents to bring Incineroar easily, where you actually often want Incineroar to come out against this Groudon because he essentially comes in, the White Herb gets rid of the Intimidate, and then Groudon can just Swords Dance and put the Incineroar in a really tricky position. To round out the team, you've got Light Clay Dual Screens Grimmsnarl with Scary Face. This isn't really anything too crazy, but Guillermo did opt for a little bit of speed here to potentially outspeed opposing Grimmsnarls. And finally, he had a very speedy Incineroar here. I say very speedy, 92 is not a ton, but the idea is that with this, you outspeed a ton of the opposing Incineroars, which is really valuable because then you can Throat Chop them and stop them from clicking Parting Shot. And you can also win Fake Out Wars that way, right, if you both lead Incineroar. So, this team just has so much offense. You have 4 potential max options in Lunala, Charizard, Regieleki, and Groudon, but all of the Pokemon are quite solid outside of max as well. I think that is one of the key strengths that you can play towards. There's a ton of offense. You can go like Charizard, Groudon lead, Grimmsnarl, Charizard lead, Regieleki, Lunala lead, Regieleki, Charizard lead, Regieleki, Groudon lead, Incineroar, Lunala, for example. So I think the flexibility here makes it really powerful. So yeah, no surprise to see Guillermo bring Lunala Groudon to Worlds, given that he was one of the most prominent Lunala Groudon users this year, but he definitely had some really smart adjustments here that, I definitely wouldn't have expected at Worlds. Eduardo ended up bringing a Thundurus, Zacian, Calyrex, Shadow Rider team to the World Championships, and this wasn't his first time using this core. He actually got top 8 at a regional level event in Bilbao just a couple of months ago before Worlds, and some of his friends, including Emilio Forbes and James Beck, had really good success with similar versions of the team. Emilio managed to win Secaucus regionals undefeated in what was probably the most difficult regionals of the season, and James got top 8 at North American Internationals with the same 6. So I wouldn't be surprised if they all put their brains together to come up with this final version that Edu ended up bringing to Worlds. Now, one of the weaknesses I always thought this archetype had is that it relies really heavily on Dynamax Thundurus, but Edu, proved to me that was not the case at all at Worlds, where he has some really good maxes with Incineroar, Calyrex, and Gastrodon. And what's interesting is when you look at this core, Thundurus, Zacian, and Calyrex is generally a really frail core, but Zacian here has a lot of bulk, right? You have max HP, 28 defense, 4 special defense investment, and the Incineroar Gastrodon Rillaboom core is just really solid defensively, right? You've got your Fire, Water, Grass core. Gastrodon's really nice for Yawn and Leftovers. It also has this Icy Wind tech, which I think is really smart. Part of the reason why I think that's smart is because Zacian, Thundurus, and Calyrex suffer against Regieleki, especially Dynamax Regieleki, but where Gastrodon becomes really interesting is that you can Icy Wind opposing Regielekis and then bring out Thundurus, Zacian, or Calyrex to deal with it afterwards, whereas sometimes it can be a little bit scary because, without Icy Wind, some players might just lead like Thundurus, Zacian, Thundurus, Calyrex, and try to play from there, but that's not exactly super easy. So the Icy Wind tech in itself is really valuable for speed control, right? But basically, Incineroar Gastrodon Rillaboom allows for a lot of switching potential, and if you watched Edu's games from Worlds, he made this look like a really defensive team, even though Thundurus, Zacian, and Calyrex inherently are more on the offensive end. And that's what I thought was also really impressive in watching him play. And so there are a couple small techs here that are really cool. Taunt on the Thundurus you normally don't expect. A lot of players would expect a fighting type attack. Brick Break, for example, a dark type attack, just some kind of coverage move. But I think from Edu's perspective, it's okay, I'm not using most of those coverage moves anyway, so I might as well have Taunt because it can really shut down opposing support Pokemon. And Taunt's always valuable in just denying your opponent the ability to protect as well, right? Allowing you to safely get knockouts with strong Pokemon like Zacian and Calyrex. The Zacian as substitute here, it is a very bulky Zacian with max HP, but still has a good amount of speed and attack investment here as well. Substitute's always one of those moves I feel like pops up at the War Championships more than anything, and it's really good in stalling out opposing Dynamaxes, which is really valuable, obviously, in this format. Incineroar here was a safety goggle set. This just gives you a lot of value against opposing Venusaurs and opposing Amoonguses. The Calyrex here notably had Snarl as well as Will-O-Wisp, and so this was what was interesting about Calyrex as well. You can actually kind of use this as a support Pokemon in the beginning of the game, thanks to Focus Sash, right? Where, okay, even if you bring it down to Sash, if it just gets a single Snarl or Will-O-Wisp off against what you think is going to Dynamax from your opponent's end, you can then switch this Pokemon out and then conserve it for the late games, and after you've chipped away at everything, Astral Barrage can very nicely clean up games for you. And so I think Snarl here isn't a move that you always saw in Calyrex, but I think it was so smart with this team. It's really valuable into special attackers like Charizard, Kyogre, Palkia, just to name a couple, for example, as opposed to as well as, you know, like Lunala, for example. Although I guess against Lunalas and Calyrexes you could just Astral Barrage, but yeah, it's just one of those moves that gives you nice coverage and also is really valuable in shutting down opposing Dynamax Pokemon. We've talked about the Gastrodon here already, and then you've got classic Assault Vest Rillaboom. So yeah, the main idea is that you have so much offense between this Thundurus, Zacian, and Calyrex core, but you have a ton of defensive support between Incineroar, Gastrodon, Rillaboom with the Fire, Water, Grass core as well. So that's a quick breakdown of both of the teams. Let's get into the finals. So I wanted to quickly touch on the matchup, and I wrote some notes down below kind of covering key Pokemon and how to maybe approach the matchup from both players' ends. And of course I just wanted to quickly touch on both players' accomplishments as well. These two guys are truly two of the best to ever play. VGC, Eduardo, has top cut multiple World Championships, top 4 in 2016, top 16 in 2019, international champion, second at internationals in Sword and Shield as well. Guillermo managed to get top 8 at Worlds all the way back in 2012, losing to Ray Rizzo. He's won multiple national championships, and so really, you know, they're two of the best to ever do it, and it was fitting that, you know, the World's Finals in Europe featured two of the best European players in the history of the game. And so if you look at the matchup for Eduardo's team, Thundurus is really strong here, right? Thundurus normally wants to come out in most matchups. It's not amazing into like Calyrex Ice teams and Trick Room teams, but it's really solid here specifically. And so it is the clear Dynamax option, but there's some world in which Rillaboom and Gastrodon can Dynamax if things don't go according to plan, or for example, if Charizard isn't prioritized early on. Rillaboom is actually really good as a late game Pokemon against Guillermo's team because the Groudon doesn't have a fire type attack, and its rock type attack is Rock Tomb, right? And so even with Swords Dance, Precipice Blades and Rock Tomb don't do that much damage to Rillaboom. Rillaboom is really solid into Groudon, Regieleki, and Lunala, which is weird to say, right? And so basically, if Guillermo wants to beat Rillaboom, he's going to need to get value out of Incineroar and Charizard or put it to sleep with Hypnosis. Incineroar on Eduardo's end here just isn't very good in this matchup, and that seems weird because normally you're like, oh, Incineroar is good into Groudon, but Guillermo's Groudon has the White Orb here, so I just don't think it's super powerful because you're essentially bringing it, you don't even have a Shuka Berry on Incineroar, it's just going to faint very easily, right? So I think for that reason, it's not a Pokemon I'd even consider very much in bringing into this matchup if I'm in Eduardo's shoes. And then finally, a Gastrodon on Eduardo's end is really strong here because Guillermo can't really knock it out very easily. If you look at the team composition here, right, basically the problem is that the Charizard is not Life Orb, and it doesn't have that much special attack investment either, so even a Charizard Solar Power in Sun going for max Airstream isn't going to KO the Gastrodon. That means that you have to double up onto Gastrodon to potentially pick up a knockout onto it, and even then, there aren't that many double ups that can guarantee you the KO here. And so it can be really disruptive thanks to Yawn Pressure, and Icy Wind is really valuable in slowing down Regieleki if you expect Guillermo to Dynamax that, for example. Now from Guillermo's end, Charizard is a really powerful option here, but it's still threatened by a lot of damage. You've got Life Orb Max Lightning from Thundurus, Behemoth Blade from Zacian, Astral Barrage, and Snarl from Calyrex Shadow Rider. So it's going to take a little bit of setup for Eduardo to or a little bit of setup for Guillermo to actually get it activated, right? I think the other problem for Guillermo here is that Eduardo knows his Weakness Policy Charizard, so he's going to play around it. He's not just going to max Lightning it on turn 1 when you have Grimmsnarl and Charizard out and just activate your Weakness Policy for you, unless he's confident that the Charizard's going down that turn. So as a result, the problem here is that Charizard's weaker because it's not the Life Orb set, but at the same time, like, how are you going to get that policy activated if Eduardo just plays around it? This is where, not having that element of surprise anymore can really hurt you a little bit. Regieleki is such an interesting option for Guillermo here because it's actually really strong into Calyrex, into Zacian, into Thundurus, and into Incineroar. We probably don't expect Incineroar to come out into this matchup, but, it's also obviously good into it. But the problem is, it's really, really weak into Gastrodon Rillaboom, right? If Gastrodon just switches in on a Max Lightning, if you Dynamax Regieleki, that in itself is just such a bad interaction that you just lose so much value out of your Dynamax, right? So you have to be extra careful when playing with Regieleki here, and If Regieleki does decide to Dynamax and gets greedy and Gastrodon is in the battle, it's just going to be so hard to win from that angle. So the tricky thing is, like, if Gastrodon isn't in the back, you can actually max Lightning pretty easily, set up electric terrain, and really blow things up. But if there's a Gastrodon in the back, you have to really respect it. So unless you know all of Edu's Pokemon, you can't play with confidence with Regieleki. Grimmsnarl here is not a trick set, it's the Light Clay set, and so it likely only will get, you know, maybe like 1 or 2 attacks off here. Reflect can be really valuable in Eduardo's team, and so even trading it for one, you know, couple turns of Reflect can be valuable, but it's important to know if you lead it here, you know, you're vulnerable to like Fake Out plus Zacian, you're vulnerable to just getting hit by like a Life Orb Max Airstream or a Behemoth Blade immediately. And finally for Guillermo, Groudon is a solid Dynamax option thanks to Swords Dance, but you have to worry about Will-O-Wisp from the opposing end, Rillaboom in general, because even with Swords Dance, like a +2 max Rockfall isn't a guaranteed KO onto Rillaboom, and then Yawn Pressure from Gastrodon as well. And so, yeah, the tough thing is, even if Groudon gets the Swords Dance up, there's no guarantee he can just sweep through the team. And so, I think, yeah, you know, the pivotal Pokemon I'm curious in watching out for in this matchup is how Eduardo handles the Regieleki on the opposing side, and how well he can play with Gastrodon in the early game if, you know, those Pokemon end up breaking out, and how well Guillermo can enable the Charizard. So, let's get into the battle. So, kicking off with game 1, Guillermo ends up leading with Lunala and Regieleki, and Eduardo goes with Rillaboom and Gastrodon. I want to take a second to just call out the Rillaboom Gastrodon lead here because I think it's really smart. To me, this felt like a specific counter to Regieleki and Lunala as a lead combination. Rillaboom and Gastrodon does not seem like a very intuitive lead into Guillermo's team. Charizard can completely destroy both of those Pokemon, but with the knowledge that Eduardo likely has on Guillermo's team, he knows, okay, it's not Life Orb Charizard, and I am not as worried about Gastrodon just getting, you know, obliterated by a Charizard Max Airstream here, right? As well as the fact that Regieleki and Lunala is a really powerful lead into most of Eduardo's team. For example, if Eduardo leads Thundurus Zacian, Thundurus Calyrex, like Regieleki and Lunala is interesting because you have a lot of combos like Electro Web plus Hypnosis, Electro Web plus Meteor Beam, Dynamax Regieleki as well. And so I think this is a really great job by Eduardo to just say, okay, I'm willing to go for a more defensive lead. If you lead Regieleki, I get to punish you super heavily. And I'm sure he's fairly happy when he sees this Lunala plus Regieleki lead. I think if Guillermo goes with something like Charizard and Groudon, things can get a little bit dicier immediately because Charizard can just pressure with like a G-Max Wildfire immediately onto the Rillaboom slot. But here, that is not the case. And so, yeah. But I think Gastrodon in general as a lead is really smart because, yeah, Guillermo just doesn't have too many ways to actually effectively KO it. And so I like Guillermo's lead a lot here as well, right? If Eduardo goes for anything else, I think Guillermo has a lot of offensive potential immediately, but now he's in a really tricky spot because there's just so much defense to play around, and the Regieleki is in a really compromising position. So, yeah. Like, what can Regieleki do in this position, right? You're not really going to want to Dynamax. You could and go for Max Strike plus Moongeist Beam, but I actually want to show this damage calc real quick as to why that play isn't actually very powerful here. If you look at the damage calc here, Max Strike from the Regieleki, and the Regieleki actually isn't max special attack, is a little bit less, but the Max Strike plus the Moongeist Beam, even if they get their maximum rolls, only does like 96%, right? And so the Gastrodon can actually survive both of those, which is absolutely crazy to think about, right? And so if you are confident in KOing Gastrodon, then yeah, maybe you can go for that. But the Gastrodon is so specially defensive here, and without knowing, you know, the Gastrodon's EV spread from Guillermo's end, it's hard to go for that play and feel confident because there's a lot that can go wrong for you, right? And so yeah, as a result, I think it puts Regieleki into a really compromising position. So continuing on with the game here. That calc is crazy to me, for me to see, by the way, because it's like, it speaks to how bulky Gastrodon can be. So, Incineroar switches in here. I think that makes a lot of sense. The idea is, okay, let me get a quick Intimidate off into the Rillaboom. Rillaboom is already actually kind of annoying for Guillermo's team given the Incineroar reveal, because unless Charizard's your final Pokemon, you know, Rillaboom actually just doesn't take that much damage from most Pokemon other than a Flare Blitz from Incineroar. So, Icy Wind comes out immediately here, and I think Earth Power from Eduardo's end could have been strong, but the idea of Icy Wind is to just slow things down a little bit. If Regieleki does end up staying in by going for Icy Wind, you set up the Thundurus, Calyrex, and Zacian potentially in the back, all for success. Next turn, we see Fake Out onto Rillaboom and Hypnosis. This play is a little interesting to me. I don't think it's a bad play by any means. Like, the idea is basically, okay, Rillaboom is a really big problem for Guillermo's team at this point. He wants to shut it down as much as possible, so by going for Fake Out onto it, even if Hypnosis misses here, you're still in an okay position because you deny a potential knockoff. And from Guillermo's perspective, he's probably trying to avoid the knockoff because, one, he doesn't want to take super effective damage on a Lunala and lose Shadow Shield, but two, he also wants to conserve Meteor Beam for Thundurus. However, it ends up being kind of this like middle ground play where, yes, you deny it an attack and Hypnosis connects, but weirdly enough, like a miss there wouldn't have been terrible because then you can at least go for it the next turn. The problem is Rillaboom takes a guaranteed turn of sleep here, and then it also leaves Gastrodon, free to get an attack off here. Guillermo may have been expecting Gastrodon to protect, or maybe he just didn't really prioritize it here because it's like, okay, Gastrodon's not at least doing damage, whereas Rillaboom can be a huge problem. But it's definitely been a passive couple of turns, right? And now your players really gotten too much damage off on the board. Gastrodon's continuing to use Icy Wind as well, so continuing to drop Incineroar speed, but once again, Icy Wind covers for anything switching in as well, which is valuable. And by going for these Icy Winds, then the Gastrodon can actually outspeed Incineroar in subsequent turns. And so Rillaboom's already taken one turn of sleep at this point. Gastrodon is still not really threatened by any damage at all, and it still has Yawn Pressure. So you can see how much work it's taking Guillermo just to get around Gastrodon, right? And that's because there's just no really strong option for his team to deal with Gastrodon, right? It's just so consistent here. So Lunala goes for Protect as Rillaboom takes another turn of sleep, and the Gastrodon goes for Yawn into the Protect. And so Guillermo gets some nice positioning here by going for Parting Shot onto the Rillaboom slot. One play I was thinking was maybe finally going on the offensive and doubling up onto Rillaboom, but I think the fear is if you Moongeist Beam and Flare Blitz it, then the Yawn goes off into the Lunala, Eduardo gets a free switch in into maybe the Thundurus, and things can get kind of dicey, right? So Guillermo is doing a really good job playing defensively, but the question is at what point can you actually get anything going, right? Because this Gastrodon is still just a major problem. Eduardo hasn't even landed the Yawns in the right slot, but it's okay because he's basically covering for all these options. So Incineroar switches in once again. At this point, Rillaboom has eaten up so many attack drops, it's not really doing anything as Groudon goes for Protect, and the Rillaboom takes its another turn of sleep. So Yawn goes into the Protect once again. So what's interesting is I feel like if Eduardo just got Yawn off into the right slot at any point, like onto Incineroar here, it's just really tricky for Guillermo because he's forced to switch out. This turn is where things get interesting, right? You know Rillaboom's taken all its turns of sleep at this point, so we'll wake up on the subsequent turn if it decides to, but what is it going to do against either Pokemon here? Not really anything, right? So Rillaboom's in a position where it's likely going to want to switch out, and from Eduardo's perspective, are you really going to bring Incineroar? Probably not. And so you can go into Thundurus, Calyrex, or Zacian, or you could sacrifice Rillaboom. I think that's one of the things that maybe it has been a little bit tricky for Guillermo this game. Do you ever want to Flare Blitz and give a KO just to give your opponent a free switch in, right? So like there are a bunch of plays that you can make here from Guillermo's end. One is just the safe Fake Out plus Swords Dance play. You could Fake Out Max Quake as well, or you could like go for something wild like Flare Blitz Rillaboom and Precipice Blades here, or double up onto the Gastrodon slot and not Dynamax here because it would cover for a potential switch out option. But I think, you know, a lot of players here might just be willing to stay in with Gastrodon and go for you can just stall out a turn because then you can just go for Yawn onto the Groudon on the subsequent turn. So what's interesting here is that Rillaboom's in a really compromising position. It can't do anything, and it is more or less forced to switch out or sacrifice itself, but Guillermo has the opportunity to get a guaranteed Fake Out plus Swords Dance here. And so Eduardo makes a really good play here. He goes for the double switch and pivots Thundurus and Calyrex in. This is pretty scary, right? Because Flare Blitz here has the potential to just KO the Thundurus immediately, and if you KO Thundurus, yeah, Incineroar takes a fair amount of chip damage, but you heal a little bit back from grassy terrain. Then, if you look at Eduardo's team, it's a Calyrex, Gastrodon, Rillaboom, and so Incineroar is really valuable into both the Calyrex and the Rillaboom from that angle, and you can switch it out and back in. And Calyrex here is also at risk of potentially eating up a double up like a Precipice Blades and attack from Incineroar onto it, right? If Calyrex faints, that can also be really scary. But I think this is a play that Eduardo can make with decent confidence because, yeah, Fake Out plus Swords Dance is the obvious play, and Guillermo just ends up going for that. So I think this was an opportunity for Guillermo to maybe make a slightly unexpected play and really gain a lot of momentum. You don't want to really max the Groudon there, but yeah, like something like Fake Out and Flare Blitz and Precipice Blades, or even KOing Calyrex there could have been interesting, but Guillermo's thinking long term here, right? He's like, okay, I want to set up Groudon, I really want this to be the sweeper. Now with Swords Dance, even if you Will-O-Wisp me, I'll still be in an okay position, so definitely can respect that. But I think Eduardo making a really nice Gastrodon switch out there. If Gastrodon just stays in and Thundurus switches in, I think Eduardo's in a much worse position going into the next turn. But now you've got Thundurus and Calyrex out next to each other. Calyrex can freely Will-O-Wisp into the Groudon slot. And yeah, I love this switch from Thundurus into Gastrodon, right? Like the only way Guillermo can really cover for it is if he actually max quicks Thundurus, but Right, that can be a fairly hard read to make, especially if Thundurus ends up just staying in and going for max Airstream. You can be in a really compromising position then. But yeah, the thing is, this Gastrodon's just been such a pain to deal with, right? So Calyrex goes for Will-O-Wisp. It very critically connects there. I think if Will-O-Wisp misses, Groudon can actually snowball this game out of control. Guillermo goes for a really safe play here of Max Rockfall, and I think that's fine, right? There's no need to read into Gastrodon switching in necessarily, as Incineroar just goes for Throat Chop here, and that's going to get the knockout after the Sandstorm. So, you know, Guillermo's saying, okay, if you stay in with Thundurus, well, I just punish you really heavily, and even if you switch out, I still get the KO onto Calyrex, thanks to the Sandstorm. It was a tricky position for Guillermo because, yeah, you could protect Groudon and go for Throat Chop onto Calyrex, but thanks to Focus Sash, should still hang around, and so might as well just maximize your damage and start get the ball rolling, right? So Thundurus switches in at this point. Like, Guillermo, I feel like, has a slight advantage, but, you know, he's got 2 turns of Dynamax, and the question is, how much value can he get out of these last 2 turns? Thundurus, of course, can go for a Protect or a Max Guard, and Incineroar actually hard pivots out into Regieleki. Now, this is a little bit interesting to me. I don't think it's a bad play. I think Guillermo essentially wanted to sacrifice Regieleki to get the free switch in into Lunala. And I think the other thing is that Guillermo recognizes Incineroar is really important to deal with Rillaboom at this point. In fact, Rillaboom can be a really good max option in this endgame, right? And so if you end up taking damage with Thundurus, that can be a little bit scary. Or sorry, with Incineroar, that can be scary. Even just like a max Airstream, plus like Earth Power onto that slot can be pretty tough, right? And so, from my perspective, Guillermo here just doesn't want to take any damage with Incineroar and goes for the hard switch rather than Parting Shot. But as a result, Thundurus makes a nice defensive play, just goes for the Protect. I think Max Rockfall into this slot is still fine, right? Because you want to just get as much damage, and it's still decent damage through Protect. But the burn is really critical there. And then Earth Power just gets the KO onto a Regieleki. So one thing I was thinking is it would be interesting if Parting Shot goes off there. Maybe Regieleki then has the chance to survive after the Parting Shot. And then you can get a free, or not a free switch in, but then Regieleki can threaten with like a Rising Voltage onto Thundurus the subsequent turn, right? Especially because Thundurus protected, but now Regieleki is just eliminated. So Eduardo did a really good job neutralizing Regieleki in this game, right? I think it is a really strong option. He led Gastrodon and Rillaboom to force it out immediately, and Regieleki just literally never got a single attack off, right? And at this point, like, Guillermo's probably thinking, okay, well, maybe I should have brought Charizard instead. Like, how valuable was Regieleki actually for me? So Lunala just managed to come in, but at this point, Eduardo's done a good job stalling out 2 turns of Dynamax, but there's still 1 more turn of Max left, right? Now, what's interesting is at this point, you have Rillaboom in the back, and it's guaranteed to wake up after the subsequent turn. And so this turn is huge. Eduardo goes for Taunt. He doesn't Dynamax Thundurus, right? And I like the decision not to Dynamax Thundurus because if you do, you are at risk of just losing Thundurus immediately. And if you commit your Dynamax here and only get 1 attack off, it often doesn't feel worth it. So instead, the Taunt here is to cover for a potential Hypnosis onto either slot. Guillermo doesn't fall into that trap though, decides to go for Moongeist Beam, and right now he really doesn't want to get hit by Yawn onto the Gastrodon slot. So he goes for the Moongeist Beam plus the Max Quake combination onto Gastrodon, and that's actually enough to get the knockout onto Gastrodon. However, now Eduardo's in a really nice position where you've stalled out the Dynamax fully on the Groudon end. So you might be wondering, okay, why not just double target the Thundurus slot there, right? It seems like a fairly free target. I think one thing is maybe worry about it switching out into Rillaboom. The other is it could go for a Fly there as well, and then the other fear is like Yawn is pretty strong, right, from the Gastrodon onto the Lunala slot. I think the problem now at this point is that even though the Thundurus has lost about half its health, Groudon's just not that strong because of the burn, right, and you're not running something like Stone Edge, it's Rock Tomb on Groudon instead. So at this point, it's really easy to, double up onto the Lunala slot and just try to KO that. And this is the awkward thing. With Incineroar not going down earlier, it actually helps the Thundurus because it actually activates Defiant, right? And that's what makes things really tricky. The other thing to note is that the Lunala here just isn't bulky at all, right? So as a result, it feints a lot easier to physical attacks. I think in this position, Guillermo has the opportunity to maybe consider switching Lunala out into Incineroar. You're going to have to give the Defiant boost to Thundurus anyway, but the logic there is in going for that. You sacrifice the Incineroar, you maybe get an attack off the Rock Tomb onto Thundurus, you get a free switch him back into Lunala, and then the next turn, you can, force the mind game with Thundurus on who to target properly. But instead, Lunala just ends up, getting eaten up here. I think the hope is maybe, okay, the Incineroar Flare Blitz can just KO Thundurus, but yeah, Life Orb just doesn't do that much. Rock Tomb does a ton of damage into Thundurus here. The other hope might be, okay, if I bring in Incineroar, like I do enough damage to win Thundurus where Incineroar can actually just click Fake Out and then win the game, but Thundurus here has 41 HP, so that is a little bit more than enough to survive a potential Fake Out from Incineroar. So now it's really awkward where it's the classic, okay, you just activate Defiant on the Thundurus, and Thundurus hangs on with just enough HP where it's in a super good spot, right? So Incineroar comes out now, ends up activating the Defiant on Thundurus, and at this point, I was really impressed by Eduardo's positioning in this endgame, because I didn't think Thundurus really could max very easily in this endgame, but he found the perfect position, managed to stall out Dynamax perfectly, because this was a game where it felt like maybe he just lost too many resources too quickly, right? But we just see Grassy Glide go out into Groudon there, and the Max Airstream here onto the Incineroar slot. So with Defiant and Life Orb, that's enough to just KO. I think at that point, like, you could consider going for Fake Out and hoping for a critical hit onto Thundurus, because if you get the critical hit there, you actually might win the game with Incineroar, Flare Blitz, and Rillaboom. But if you don't think a crit's even going to get the knockout there, then yeah, I can see why maybe you don't feel like it's worth it. Or you could hope for Eduardo to mess up and for some reason double up onto the Groudon slot, Flare Blitz KOs Thundurus, and you win the 1v1 against Rillaboom. So yeah, point is here though, Thundurus just has a little bit of HP, but it's more than enough to end up winning this ending game. And I think that the main problem for Guillermo in this game was that the Gastrodon Rillaboom lead was just really, really tough to break through, and Regieleki basically did nothing. Eduardo did a really good job neutralizing Regieleki, and it was tough for Guillermo to ever make like really safe and consistent plays. And so yeah, I don't think he played the game poorly at all. I think it's just like he never had an opportunity to do much damage to Gastrodon, and that's because the nature of his team is that there's just not that much that can handle Gastrodon, even with double ups, as I mentioned, right? And so as a result, like, it's like, yeah, what can Guillermo do to deal with Gastrodon? So if you put yourself in Guillermo's shoes going into game 2, Regieleki essentially accomplished nothing in game 1, right? It felt like Eduardo had a pretty significant advantage thanks to his Rillaboom and Gastrodon lead, and so Guillermo's now probably trying to think of a way to counter Rillaboom and Gastrodon. Charizard inherently is the strongest against that duo specifically, and it's also just quite good into all of Eduardo's team, right? So from Guillermo's perspective, now maybe you want to drop the Regieleki and bring Charizard instead. If you bring Charizard, you could go with combinations like Charizard plus Groudon, Charizard plus Grimmsnarl, and even Charizard plus Regieleki. That one's probably the most volatile out of the three that I just mentioned, but it can pull off some shenanigans. But how confident are you with that in, down a game in the World's Finals? From Eduardo's perspective, things are interesting because he didn't bring Zacian in the previous game, right? And he might be thinking, okay, well, I just destroyed your Regieleki. You're probably not as confident bringing that anymore. So now Eduardo can think about bringing a more offensive mode that's more weak to Regieleki, such as Thundurus Calyrex and Thundurus Zacian. You could also make the decision to actually drop the Gastrodon here and this time bring both of your restricteds. I think Gastrodon in the back can still work, but the thing is, a late game Gastrodon can be pretty passive, whereas, you just deal the most amount of damage if you go with Thundurus, Calyrex, Zacian, and Rillaboom. Once again, I think Incineroar is essentially a non-factor for Eduardo here, so it's always debating between which 4 of the 5 you want to bring between Thundurus, Zacian, Calyrex, Rillaboom, and Gastrodon. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about it from both players' perspectives, where, Eduardo has a game lead, and so he can mix things up a little bit here. I think Rillaboom and Gastrodon is just too passive to work two games in a row, and Guillermo's too smart, to lose that twice, I think. So we're going to see the switch into Thundurus and Zacian this time around against Charizard and Grimmsnarl. So before we even get into things, I want to just highlight one damage calc here, which is Max Lightning from the Thundurus here, right? Thundurus Max Lightning into Dynamax Charizard is never a guaranteed KO, and so this means that the Charizard can just take a Max Lightning immediately, but you still have to worry about Max Lightning plus Behemoth Blade immediately onto the Charizard, right? That's one thing to watch out for. And so I think there are a bunch of plays that you can make in this position if you're Guillermo. Guillermo doesn't have something like Trick, right? It's Dual Screen, Spirit Break, and Scary Face. So you could Scary Face Zacian and G-Max Wildfire it. You could Reflect and G-Max Wildfire. You could Reflect and Max Guard. You could switch in a Groudon and Wildfire into either slot. What's tricky is that Eduardo has the inherent speed advantage here, and he's not going to just fall for the bait of Max Lightning onto Charizard, right? It's just like the fact that it's Weakness Policy Charizard means you're going to play around it. So Guillermo certainly has a lot of options here, and but it's still scary. Thundurus Zacian is just the most oppressive duo, I think, out of all the lead combinations on that team. You could argue like Calyrex slotted over one of the two maybe can be a little bit more scary, but this is just so much damage. And even though Charizard's fairly decent into both of these, both of these still outspeed Charizard and can deal so much damage, right? So I mentioned a couple of options like Guillermo could go for. From Eduardo's end, I think you could, you know, max Airstream and Behemoth Blade the Charizard. You could max Lightning Behemoth Blade it, but that's a little bit risky because if Scary Face goes off here, the Charizard survives and then Wildfire just guarantees the KO into Zacian. So Guillermo does opt for the Scary Face option onto the Zacian, and Thundurus does not opt for Max Lightning, so very smart to just Max Airstream there. You can see the amount of bulk on Charizard there, right? It actually survives with over 50%, so once again, this is Max HP Charizard coming in handy. Charizard does go for the G-Max Wildfire here immediately, and critically, the Zacian actually survives, and so this is the downside of running a very bulky Charizard with 100 attack, special attack EVs with Zacian not having any bulk. So, no Reflect ends up being set up, and it's just an immediate knockout here, and the Zacian just faints immediately after Wildfire. But it gets a very critical Behemoth Blade off there, right? Because if you don't get that, then Grimmsnark can hang around for a little bit longer, go for another Scary Face, or go for a Light Screen as well. And so if you're Eduardo, I think you take that trade any day of the week, because now you get a free switch in. You can just go into Calyrex Shadow Rider and put on so much pressure. Thundurus plus Calyrex can just beat everything from Guillermo's end at this point. So indeed, it is Calyrex that comes out, and Groudon comes out here from Guillermo's end. So I quickly want to show the damage calc there if you're wondering about the G-Max Wildfire. It is a 31.3% chance to get the one-hit KO here, as you can see. So if you're Guillermo, you might actually, you know, expect that, right? Because Guillermo has probably been able to watch some of Eduardo's games from the previous day at this point. He knows that the Zacian has max HP based off its HP stat. And so he probably recognizes it's not a guaranteed KO, right? But he's still willing to go for it. This is the exact damage calc here, but of course Guillermo doesn't know about how much special defense investment the Zacian has. But that's a weird calc. I never thought I'd see a day where a Zacian can actually survive a G-Max Wildfire from Charizard. But here we are, which is just, yeah, it's still wild to me. So, keeping the battle going here, Groudon comes out, and now Eduardo's in a really commanding position, right? You've got Thundurus, you've got Calyrex out next to each other. It's really safe to just max Airstream Charizard and Astro Barrage, right? Airstream plus Charizard guarantees, Airstream plus Astro guarantees the KO on a Charizard. Even if Charizard max guards, like, Groudon still takes a lot of damage from Astral Barrage, right? And so it's relatively safe. And I said Airstream, actually, max Lightning is fine. You don't really need a speed boost at this point. You can just go for the KO immediately onto it. But yeah, I think either is acceptable in this position. Either way, though, now Guillermo has to make a tough call, like whether or not to max guard. He does correctly max guard here as Lightning goes into that slot. And so there's no damage from there, and Calyrex goes for Astral Barrage. You could go for Will-O-Wisp here, but I think from Eduardo's perspective, it's like, okay, well, if I just max Lightning Astral Barrage, the next turn I can just max Lightning Astral Barrage again, I should be in a really good position, right? Because Astral Barrage does a fair amount to the Groudon here. So Precipice Blaze comes out, does connect on the Calyrex, and Solar Power ticks away at Charizard as well. So this turn is interesting because, of course, Eduardo could have gone for max Airstream on the Groudon, but basically, let's pull up the damage calcs here once again. If you see here, first of all, this is how much Astral Barrage does into Groudon, so it did 88, so it's right around the mid-range there. Max Airstream, as you can see here, does 48.7 to 57.6%, and I bolded the 117 because that's basically the only damage roll in which you would have actually KO'd Groudon. So, from Eduardo's perspective, let's say you make a read and you max Airstream Astral Barrage to the Groudon. You know, Groudon is likely going to survive that double up there. And then if Guillermo just makes an aggressive read and just G-Max Wildfires and a Thundurus there, you're in really bad shape. So, Eduardo, you know, doesn't read into playing around the Protect because he doesn't necessarily need to, right? This next turn now, you still threaten Max Lightning onto that slot and then another Astral Barrage. So that's kind of the logic there from both players. So Guillermo, however, correctly does max guard there rather than greeting it and just going for an attack. So now Guillermo could consider switching out, but he's just going to sacrifice the Charizard here, right? And so now it's a single target Astral Barrage and a Groudon. Like, the logic in switching out the Charizard there is that you go into Incineroar, you expect the Lightning to go into that slot, right? And then, you know, if you can survive the max Lightning, I guess that's the thing, right? Whether or not you're confident you survive max Lightning. Because if you think you're going down anyway, then you just have to hope that you survive the Astral Barrage. But if you can survive, then the Astral Barrage at least is not single target. It still has to hit both Pokemon, meaning that it does a little bit more damage. And so right, at this point, it's looking like it's Eduardo's game, right? So Astral Barrage comes out from the Calyrex, and I expected to pick up the knockout here. And it actually survives with 4 HP, which is wild. And Rock Tomb correctly goes into Calyrex here, just gets the knockout onto that immediately. And so that's wild to me. So I was also curious about the damage calc there. And so as you can see here, in 75% of the scenarios, the single target Astro Barrage gets the knockout on a Groudon. So Edu had a 75% chance to be world champion there immediately, but the Groudon actually very critically survives the Astro Barrage and is able to, hang on for a little bit longer there, which is huge. And so it goes to show how like every single EV spread can matter when you're playing at this level, right? Because damage rolls are a thing. And so yeah, if Groudon faints there, the game is just immediately over, right? There's no way Guillermo can come back from that position, 3v1 especially. But now you actually get the knockout. Rillaboom is the final Pokemon here, and Incineroar is the final Pokemon. So this is interesting already because Eduardo at this point is committed to Rillaboom rather than Gastrodon. Gastrodon's actually not terrible into either of these, right? Because you can Icy Wind to just KO the Groudon, and then you can Yawn/Earth Power away into the Incineroar slot. But it makes sense for Eduardo to play towards Rillaboom because it's really good once you've cleared the Charizard, right? The awkward thing is that the Rillaboom is actually still kind of weak into the Incineroar right now. And so Dynamax now ends on the Thundurus as well. So this is the most important turn for this game at this state. Either player can still win at this point, but it is actually a fairly complex turn, right? Both players have fake out pressure. Groudon can protect. Groudon's faster than Rillaboom, so something like Rock Tomb plus Flare Blitz will just KO Rillaboom if it decides to go for like a high horsepower, because you'll get the speed drop before Rillaboom can move. So there's a lot of different plays that both players can make. So looking at it from Eduardo's perspective right now, let's take a look. So Fake Out plus Wild Charge onto Incineroar here wins if you expect Groudon to protect, right? Because you prevent Incineroar from attacking, and then the next turn another Wild Charge KOs Incineroar, Grassy Glide just KOs Groudon. But if Groudon does not protect and simply just goes for Rock Tomb onto the Thundurus, then you'll lose the game. You could also click Fake Out onto the Groudon and then Wild Charge onto the Incineroar, and that works if the Incineroar does not click Fake Out and then Flare Blitz is on Rillaboom. So basically in this position, let's say Groudon just Rock Tombs Thundurus, Flare Blitzes on a Rillaboom. Rillaboom KOs Groudon before it can move. The Wild Charge goes off into the Incineroar slot, and then Incineroar Flare Blitzes Rillaboom and takes so much recoil damage. It might just faint from recoil, but even if not, Thundurus can just win by Wild Charging Incineroar next turn. But if the Groudon simply protects there and then Incineroar Throat Chops the Thundurus, then you'll lose, right? Because the Wild Charge goes off into Incineroar, doesn't KO, Throat Chop KOs Thundurus, Groudon survives, and then the next turn, a Flare Blitz will just KO Rillaboom, right? There's still 3 more turns of Sun, as you can see down below as well. Another possible play is to actually click Fake Out onto the Groudon and then fly onto Incineroar. So basically in this position, if Groudon doesn't protect, Fake Out KOs it, you fly up, so Incineroar can't KO the Thundurus this turn, and if Incineroar decides to Flare Blitz the Rillaboom, it takes a ton of recoil, enough where maybe a fly will just finish off Incineroar on the subsequent turn. I don't think it's a guaranteed victory thanks to Grassy Terrain recovery, and it comes down to how much a fly does, right? But at the end, it's still a possibility to win. But as you can see, essentially there are a bunch of different plays, but in at least my eyes reading this situation, I don't think there's a single play for either player that guarantees the win. You kind of just have to make an educated guess on what your opponent is going to go for. The last option I've seen some players talk about is Fake Out plus Fly into Incineroar. So the idea here is you Fake Out into it, denied attack, Thundurus flies up, so avoids a Rock Tomb, right? But then it's still kind of awkward because Fly and High Horsepower the next turn doesn't actually KO the Incineroar. And so then if you go for that, then Guillermo just wins with Rock Tomb onto Thundurus and Flare Blitz onto Rillaboom. The thing though is how confident are both players in that position for the damage calcs, right? So doing the numbers, like we know that Fly and High Horsepower won't KO, but you have to imagine that players don't necessarily know that in that position, right? But I'm just pointing out all the ways that the game can kind of break into. Of course, then, if Fly goes up, the next turn Groudon can go for Protect as Thundurus flies down onto the Incineroar slot, right? But then the thing is, Incineroar can just Throat Chop the Thundurus, and with Wildfire, chip damage, that's enough for a KO, and then Rock Tomb and Flare Blitz just KOs Rillaboom the next turn. So, as you can see, it's a fairly complex situation where, you know, each player has a possibility to win, but you have to find the right play, and it's really dicey with both Pokemon having Fake Out pressure as well as Groudon having Protect pressure. So as you can see here, Throat Chop does minimum 69 to maximum 82, but when you account for Life Orb on the Thundurus as well as the G-Max Wildfire, it is simply just going to faint. If you look here, Wild Charge and Fly does about 61 to 73% to the Incineroar, Fake Out does 7 to 9%, and then High Horsepower does 17 to 20%. But thanks to Grassy Terrain here, even with maximum rolls on Fake Out, Fly, and High Horsepower, Incineroar can survive, right? Which is a lot at this point in the battle. And so, yeah, those are just a couple of scenarios that I've listed out, and so it comes down to whether or not Guillermo decides to click Fake Out on the Incineroar, and more importantly, what he does with Groudon. Do you decide to go for a Protect in this situation? So, this was a really complex turn, and so the Groudon does not Protect, Fake Out goes into the Incineroar, Wild Charge goes into it, Eduardo tries to make the call that Groudon is going to protect, but it ends up not going for it. Rock Tomb just connects onto Thundurus, and Guillermo makes a really incredible play to keep himself in the World Championship. At this point, the game is still not 100% over, right? There is theoretically the possibility that Rock Tomb misses, and then High Horsepower gets a critical hit onto Incineroar, but from Guillermo's perspective, you just click Rock Tomb and Flare Blitz, and that should not ensure you the victory 100%. You still need to avoid the crit and hope that you connect on the Rock Tomb, but if you Grassy Glide Groudon here, Incineroar always just wins the game, right? So Eduardo correctly does not go for Glide, hopes for a Rock Tomb miss, but Rock Tomb doesn't miss, and then Flare Blitz here simply finishes off the Rillaboom. So really clutch play by Guillermo there, not protecting the Groudon. As you'll notice, he actually did not click Fake Out on Incineroar that turn either, which is a really gutsy call, right? So in this scenario, given the play like Guillermo made, essentially what could have happened for Eduardo to win the game was indeed Fake Out into the Groudon and then click Fly into the Incineroar slot. But it's a fairly tough play to make, right? Because there's so much that can go wrong there. If Incineroar clicks Fake Out or the Groudon decides to protect there, it could really go downhill. So, yeah. What's interesting is from that position, both players could still win the game, but Guillermo pulling out an incredible play to bring us to a Game 3 here. So, yeah, this was a really, really complicated endgame, but ultimately, like, Eduardo had a lot, like, that didn't go in his favor, right? So he ended up not getting this turn correctly. The Groudon obviously survived only on 4 HP. And then the turn that Charizard max guarded, he maybe could have read into a max Airstream Groudon. But if I were in his shoes, I would have made the exact same play because I would expect the Astro Barrage, like I mentioned, to KO the Groudon. So, yeah. Either way, though, it brings us to a really exciting finish for Game 2 and leads us to Game 3. So going into Game 3, I once again just want to walk through what I would think about if I were in either player's shoes, right? So from Eduardo's perspective, there are 3 different moments I could have won him that previous game. He was really, really close to winning. In retrospect, if he had gone for max Airstream on a Groudon to turn that Charizard max guarded, he likely just wins the game there immediately. But if I were in Eduardo's shoes, I would have gone for the exact same play, which was just go for the safe max lightning on a Charizard, because I would expect Groudon to faint from the, regular Astro Barrage into single target Astro Barrage. The second point is if the Groudon just faints from the single target Astro Barrage, the game is just over. And the third point is if Guillermo does not make the right prediction there in the end, Eduardo also wins the game, right? So there's 3 different points that all did not go in his favor, and if any of those go in his favor, he's world champion. So he might be willing to just run it back with the exact same Pokemon. The one thing you could do, I think, is maybe drop Rillaboom for Gastrodon, because if you think Guillermo's going to play a more Regieleki-centric strategy, Gastrodon can be a little bit stronger, but Rillaboom is still really valuable in winning you the end game against things like Groudon, and yeah, it's just still really strong, right? The interesting thing is that Gastrodon may have given Eduardo a slightly better shot in that end game, but it's one of those where, yeah, like Rillaboom's a little bit more consistent, and it's still nice as a switching into Regieleki. I think where things get scary for Eduardo is if Guillermo goes back to Regieleki and Lunala, so Eduardo can go back to Rillaboom and Gastrodon, but it's so volatile in my opinion, and it's super weak against a Charizard lead specifically, and Guillermo's clearly willing to play towards Charizard, so I don't think it's that strong or effective. Finally, even if Guillermo goes with Regieleki and Lunala, Thundurus and Zacian still has answers against it. If you protect the right Pokemon, for example, and just knock out the Regieleki with like a Behemoth Blade or Sacred Sword, that can give you a big advantage immediately. It just means that you might have to make a good call on turn 1 instead, right? So Eduardo probably doesn't love going up against Regieleki Lunala with the Thundurus Zacian lead, but he can still find a play to, come out positive in turn 1. From Guillermo's perspective, you now know that Scary Face and Wildfire just doesn't guarantee you the KO on Zacian, and so like that trade-off actually didn't work out super well for him in Game 2. So leading Charizard is fairly volatile, but you do have Reflect as an option. You can run it back with the Regieleki Lunala lead from Game 1, especially since Edu did not bring Gastrodon in Game 2, but if Edu does adjust back to it, you can't play confidently at all in the early game, and the question is whether or not that's worth it. The Regieleki got completely destroyed in Game 1, so from Guillermo's perspective, it makes so much sense not to bring Regieleki back out into Game 3, and so it would be a really bold call to end up doing it. So, yeah, that's kind of the perspective I would think from both players' ends. It's always hard. I think Game 3 in VGC, it's like, do you go with your gut? Do you actually make an adjustment? And here, actually, neither player makes an adjustment. So it's Grimmsnarl and Charizard here against Thundurus and Zacian. Now, I think Eduardo once again can just go for the safe max Lightning plus Behemoth Blade play, right? There's really not too much downside there. From Guillermo's perspective, what you could do is, or sorry, not max Lightning, max Airstream play. You never actually want to max Lightning here because you don't want to activate Weakness Policy on Charizard, and you don't want Groudon as a switch-in, right? So, yeah, Airstream plus Behemoth Blade is really consistent. Guillermo's best response to that would be Max Guard Charizard turn 1, you sacrifice Grimmsnarl, and then get the free switch in into Groudon or Regieleki if you brought it. Charizard, however, decides not to max guard, decides to just go for Protect instead. So Grimmsnarl just sets up a Reflect here. And so Reflect is really valuable, right, you would think, but it's still not going to help the Grimmsnarl survive this turn, so Grimmsnarl still ends up fainting. And the thing is, this still means that Charizard now takes damage through Protect, and it's going to be a max Airstream through the Protect, and it takes 29 damage here. So this indicates to me, Guillermo is essentially trying to go all in on winning the game off Max Charizard, right? The hope is, okay, I don't take that much damage now, I can bring in Groudon, Max Charizard. If Charizard survives the Max Lightning and Behemoth Blade double up here, you actually win the game, right? Because Weakness Policy gets activated, G-Max Wildfire goes into Thundurus, Restless Blades goes into Zacian. Eduardo's perspective here also might now be like, oh, wow, I'm not sure I actually get the knockout onto Charizard with Max Lightning and Behemoth Blade. Maybe I should just Max Airstream instead of clicking Max Lightning. Guillermo, of course, could consider maxing the Groudon here as well. That's another option, but the question is, do you think you'll win the game with Max Groudon if there's a Calyrex and Rillaboom in the back, which was the case in the last one? It's, a little bit tricky here. Especially because Max Rockfall doesn't actually get the KO onto Thundurus from this range, especially since Groudon doesn't have that much attack investment. So Guillermo has to max this turn, and he is going to go for, indeed, what is the Max Charizard. Now, going for Max Charizard means this is really risky, right? Because if you feint to Max Lightning and Behemoth Blade, the game is just over. And so, that is what Eduardo starts with. He's going to go for Behemoth Blade onto the Charizard slot. It still survives with over 50%. Reflect is up. This is max HP Charizard, Dynamax Life Orb, Max Lightning into Charizard, and that's still enough for a one-hit KO. And after that, Eduardo knows he's going to be world champion at that point. Like, there's basically very, very little that you can do to come back from this. Like, Guillermo can play perfectly, but the game is just over. So, Guillermo basically went all in on trying to get the KO through that, and ends up, just fainting, right? But you can see the variance, right? If Charizard survives there, G-Max Wildfire goes into Thundurus, Policy is activated, you get a double KO, then Eduardo is forced to bring out his final two Pokemon, and then Incineroar is really valuable in the end game for Eduardo. But at this point, Incineroar just comes out, gives a Defiant boost to Thundurus. All you have to do at this point, if you're Eduardo, is make sure you target the Pokemon that doesn't have Protect, right? The one way you could lose this game is, I don't know, if you Groudon protects, maybe Max Airstream into it, you just whiff an attack completely. Eduardo goes for the perfect play here. Zacian protects, takes no damage, right, to a fake out. Max Airstream onto Incineroar here is really safe because it puts the Incineroar in KO range essentially from anything else, and the Rock Tomb goes off into Thundurus. Guillermo makes the right call here, and it, ends up targeting Thundurus, activates Defiant there. Defiant doesn't actually end up mattering because Flare Blitz comes out, but it doesn't really matter at this point, right? Eduardo still has two Pokemon in the back. His Zacian now can just freely go for an attack as well, correctly protecting it, and Incineroar takes so much damage from the recoil from Flare Blitz as well, right? So you can just bring out the Calyrex, Astral Barrage, Behemoth Blade, and then just Astral Barrage again. Rillaboom or Gastrodon will easily close out the game as well. So this game was decided immediately on turn 2 of the battle, and I'm going to go through some damage calcs in a little bit because the calcs were actually super interesting to look at here. But if I were in Guillermo's position on turn 2, I think I would have made the same play. The only thing you could really do better is if you are 100% sure Charizard's fainting there, right? If you're 100% sure, then the play to go for is double Protect with Charizard, Dynamax Groudon, and then, try to go for, Max Rockfall into Thundurus, for example. Dynamax Groudon isn't necessarily terrible here, especially because Reflect was set up at this point in the game, but you still have to deal with Calyrex plus Rillaboom, and Calyrex can Will-O-Wisp you, which is really annoying. But with Incineroar in the back, maybe it was still more doable. So, yeah. Basically, the turn 2 play is you're hoping Charizard survives. If you think there's any chance it can survive, you just kind of go for it, right? And once again, I'm able to do this analysis after seeing both teams' EV spreads and doing the damage calcs, but in the heat of the moment, you never know any of this with confidence, right? So Eduardo wins in a very, very commanding Game 3. Huge congratulations to him on, really, yeah, just the most dominant run in VGC World's history. So I do want to pull up some damage calcs because I think they're really interesting to look at in this game, and it shows, yeah, just the difference between Max Guard versus Protect on turn 1 of the battle. So let's pull up the calcs here. So first of all, this is how much Behemoth Blade does to Max Charizard, right? And Eduardo actually got a slightly lower roll there as well. But with Max Lightning here, the Charizard at 312 HP, and you can see minimum Behemoth Blade does 121, and the Max Lightning does 208. So you add that up, and that's 329. That's never enough for Charizard to survive from Guillermo's end after the Max Airstream chip damage. However, if there is no chip damage, then only in 9% of scenarios does the double up actually KO Charizard for max HP. You guys can maybe do the math to double check that, but yeah, that was what I calculated. And so that's a huge difference, right? It goes from, okay, by Charizard protecting there, you always feint to the double up the next turn, to if Charizard max guards, then it's actually very difficult for the Lightning and Behemoth Blade to KO. And so, I think, yeah, that's like one thing Guillermo could have done differently in this game. And it's like, this is a format where there's such little room for error, right? So as soon as he doesn't go for Protector, he gets punished really heavily, unfortunately. And once again, if I were in his shoes, I honestly thought like the Charizard could survive Max Lightning and Blade from that position. And you can see the World Championship win in your eyes, right? Where it's like, okay, if I do survive, I just win the game, most likely by picking up a double knockout there. So it's really, really close there. But in the end, now seeing the numbers, it's actually not enough. So Guillermo Dynamax's Groudon, it's interesting, right? Because Dynamax Groudon does have the potential to clean up through Thundurus, Zacian, and Calyrex. So I think that's the other option you can take in this game. You protect Charizard, you Dynamax Groudon. As you can see here, Max Rockfall does not KO the Thundurus though, right? So I think if you get the double protect with Charizard, things are actually maybe still salvageable. The problem is if you don't get the double with Charizard, Incineroar comes out and gives Thundurus a Defiant boost, and that's still really scary. But the thing is, Max Groudon is interesting because it can set up the Sandstorm, which breaks Calyrex's Focus Sash, and then Groudon plus the Incineroar can actually win against Rillaboom and Calyrex as well. So if you're a gamer like in Guillermo's shoes and you know Charizard's always fainting there, then yeah, you can go for the double. But if you don't have full conviction that it's guaranteed to feint from that, and you see a potential way to win Worlds immediately, I don't fault him for making that play whatsoever. Max Quick here, as you see, is a guaranteed knockout on Zacian, whereas Rockfall only does 58.7 to around 70%-ish or so. So ultimately in this game, there are two different approaches Guillermo could have taken. I'm sure he's thought about the max guard play a lot. At the end, it is hard to play perfect Pokemon. This is, you know, the hardest match of your life, and these guys are both better players than me, right? Like they're in the World's Finals. As someone who was really close to making World's Finals, but you know, fell short and lost in the top 4, it's so hard to even get there in the first place. And the stress of being in World's Finals is just immense as well, right? And in the end, that one lack of max guard ends up punishing him. From that angle, I think you could still win the game, maybe from Max Groudon, but it's really tricky. Like I said, yeah, it's Max Groudon and then just try to go for a double protect with Charizard and maybe play from there. But I do want to talk about some other options Guillermo had available to him, because Regieleki plus Lunala, mixing it back up there is interesting, and I wanted to pull up some damage calcs that are relevant here. So Max Alecki actually has a 5/8 chance to just one-shot Zacian. It does not ever get the one-hit KO onto the Thundurus here, but you can go for something like an Electro Web plus Meteor Beam with Regieleki and Lunala to get the KO onto Thundurus. So basically I was thinking, if you go with Regieleki and Lunala, you have a bunch of options available to you immediately. You could Electro Web and Meteor Beam into Thundurus if you think Thundurus is just going to Dynamax and attack. And if you call that correctly and you get the KO, you are actually in such a good position, right? Because you don't even haven't even conserved your Dynamax at that point. But it's a little bit risky, of course, because Thundurus could just protect, and then Zacian could just KO the Regieleki. So if you think the Thundurus is going to Max Guard or Protect, you could Electro Web and Hypnosis into Zacian, right? This is max speed Lunala, so after an Electro Web, the Lunala will outspeed the Zacian, so you drop the Zacian speed. If Thundurus protects and Hypnosis connects, you're in an amazing position going into the next turn, because then you can go for Electro Web, Meteor Beam again, or consider Dynamaxing Regieleki. Another option is actually just Dynamaxing Regieleki outright and just going for Max Lightning onto Zacian to try to KO that, and then Hypnosis into Thundurus if you think to kind of cover for both options, right? And ultimately, Eduardo did not bring Gastrodon in this matchup, so I actually think Regieleki and Lunala could have worked out really well in this third game, but of course, it's hard to feel confident with that given like how poorly it ended up playing out in game 1. And so this is what's really interesting to me about VGC. Eduardo plays a very unique strategy with Rillaboom Gastrodon in the first game. It's really defensive, but completely shuts down the Regieleki Lunala combination, so much to the point where Guillermo does not want to consider it for games 2 and 3. Eduardo then goes for Zacian plus the Thundurus, which is a little bit more weak to Regieleki and Lunala because he feels more confident at this point Guillermo's not going to go for it, and for Eduardo, it's great for him to see that it doesn't come back out in game 3, right? And so I think that would have maybe given Guillermo a better shot here in the final game, but once again, don't fault him for not going with that given that it didn't work well in game 1. Part of VGC is really being able to get the leads right. Sometimes it does feel like it is just a really, really difficult guessing game, and Eduardo got the better end of it in this one, right? But ultimately, it was a fantastically played finals. I feel like Eduardo never made any mistakes. Like, there are some turns where you can be like, oh, you could have done like this play, and it would maybe give you a slight advantage, but it never felt like he like just blatantly got the turn wrong, which is a really impressive skill. He just like maneuvered the board state so well, and you know, when looking over all 3 battles, there was never a point where I was like, yeah, this was incorrect. It was always, yeah, there was another option, but I'm not even sure that was a better option. He was always trying to, you know, cover for all of his bases and did such a good job in doing so. And I think Guillermo in game 1 just was in a really tough spot because of the lead matchup. Made a great adjustment in game 2. Didn't even get the KO onto Zacian because the Charizard, yeah, just didn't have that much special attack investment. Hung on just with a server of HP, made the right end game play. And in game 3, yeah, just ended up not max guarding Charizard, and that just unfortunately punished him really heavily. But like I mentioned, these guys are both truly world-class players and, you know, some of the best to ever do it. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this analysis. I honestly had a lot of fun making it. I spent hours kind of just digging into it today, kind of pulling out damage calcs, putting myself in both players' positions, and thinking about how they could have approached it. Pokemon's a game where if you put these guys in the finals and you play multiple best of 3s, you'd see so many adaptations along the way, right? Like, you could play 10 games and they would look completely differently. And I'm sure Guillermo's thought a lot about, you know, either max guarding Charizard or maxing Groudon or just going with Regieleki Lunala in this final game. But ultimately, there can obviously only be one winner, and in the end it is going to be Eduardo. So yeah, huge congrats to both players on truly an amazing run. I once again think this is the hardest world championship in VGC history, and yeah, I think these guys have just clearly established how good they are at the game, and the finals itself was honestly really exciting and just, you know, such a nail biter as well. So thanks so much for watching the analysis. Leave any feedback down in the comment section below, leave a like if you enjoy, and yeah, until next time, if this is something you want to see me do for other VGC formats or just, you know, major tournaments in general more frequently, let me know in the comment section below as well, and I really appreciate you all for watching. So I'll see you next time. All right, peace.